I know some people are confused about the relationship between the law of God and the Christian way of life. My purpose today is to I want to give you some fundamental principles. I think it'd be helpful to you if you wrote them down, and you're going to get them later if you need to, but to write these down and slip them in the back of your Bible and remind yourself of them from time to time as you read along in your Bible. The reason I'm suggesting this is because I'm not offering these to you as new truths or as fundamental truths or as doctrine. I'm offering them to you as principles for you to study and to think about as you read the Bible, to see if they will open your understanding and clear up some of the confusion that oftentimes exists in people's minds relative to the law of God and the life of a Christian. One of the reasons this question is difficult is because of the well-intentioned efforts by some people to rationalize the question of why Christians don't observe the law the way the Jews did. Now, it's an awkward question because it is plain to anybody that thou shalt not murder is just as valid today as it ever was at any time in history, right? We're all in agreement on that it's important to tell the truth. It's important that we not bear false witness. It's important that we not steal. Everybody understands that so much of the fundamental principles of the law of God are eternal. And so, but then they come along and they find that there are conflicts between what we do in our lives or what we think are the right and wrong things to do and what the law says. And there are many attempts to rationalize that. In fact, Christians don't observe the law the way the Jews did. In fact, I think many Jews do not observe the law the way the Jews used to observe the law. And it's the attempt to rationalize this that I think many people get in trouble. Some people argue that the whole law, all of it, was abolished at the cross. Every bit of it. 10 Commandments, the whole smear was abolished at the cross. And 9 of the 10 Commandments were reinstated later, and you may have heard that particular argument. Still others, and this one's new to me, I hadn't really heard this one before, that the law was did not actually pass until the destruction of the temple, that it continued in effect sort of lame duck style until the temple was destroyed, and at that time the law was abolished. Other people argue that, no, it was the ceremonial law that was abolished. The moral law remains intact. And then there comes a question as to what is moral law and what is ceremonial law. Others argue that all the laws that existed that inside the Old Covenant were passed away with the Old Covenant, and we no longer have to obey those laws. There are, these are kind of the rough outlines of what people have taught or argued in an attempt to rationalize why we keep some laws and why we don't do others, or as one fellow once asked me, why is it that we play hopscotch through the Old Testament, choosing which of these laws we will obey and which of them we will not obey. The problem is that every one of these theories, and that's what they are, founder on one simple passage from the Sermon on the Mount. One simple, very clear passage. You're familiar with it probably. It's Matthew 5 and verse 17. Now, the reason why Jesus makes this statement is because he is about to embark on a message in which he is simply a teacher of the law. He sits as the teacher of the law, explaining the law of God, explaining its applications and how strict or not strict it should be, how important it is in certain aspects of your life or how much it's not important. His whole approach to this is going to be quite different from what his audience has previously thought. And therefore, because he does not want them to misunderstand them, he starts out by saying, don't think I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, I am come to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all has come to pass. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Which, by the way, raises the interesting question, how is it possible that someone who does not do them or does not teach them can even be in the kingdom of heaven to be called small or great? And this is a question that has kind of dogged our minds for many, many years. Maybe we can get a clue to it today. For I say unto you, that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now that's a breathtaking statement, this whole section is. I'm aware of all the arguments that Jesus fulfilled the law and therefore the law could pass away because of that fulfillment. However, those arguments are lexically and grammatically wrong. They simply don't work. The Greek does not say that. The word fulfilled in the King James translation that is translated there is simply the Greek word which means come to pass. And now besides, it's a twofold promise. One is, till heaven and earth have passed, until everything has come to pass, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law. Is that clear? I don't know how anything could be clearer, and I don't know how very many things that could be more troubling. Because there are a lot of things in the law of God that we do not observe, and probably never will observe. There are some things in the law of God that just seems impossible for us to observe. We don't even have a way to do them. And therefore, when you come up against these questions in the reading of the law, they can be very troubling. The only thing that this particular argument about fulfillment of it has going for it is that, and the people who advance it basically do this, is that it has to mean that, because otherwise, because Jesus could not possibly mean what he appears to have said. In logic, this is called begging the question. And you run into this a lot, as a matter of fact, in theological arguments where people assume, well, this has got to be this way, because for it to be otherwise is unthinkable. Well, perhaps not. Because I can assure you that lexically and grammatically, now you may have a problem theologically, but lexically, that is according to what the Greek lexicon says, grammatically, according to the structure of the Greek in these passages, Jesus said that he was not going to cause one jot or one tittle, which means he's talking about the written law, to pass from the law till heaven and earth pass and everything in history is complete. That is what he said. Now we have to struggle with that and try to understand what he means. I don't really understand how much of anything could be said more clearly. It's hard to imagine anything that was more confusing to a modern audience, though, at the same time. But I gather from the context, and this is what I thought was interesting. From the context, I would gather that that statement posed no problem to the audience that heard it. There was no murmuring. Nobody seemed to get excited about it. Nobody got up and walked out. There were several places where Jesus got in trouble over things that he said in his sermons, right? There are no questions raised about this statement. I think that it's fair to say that Jesus' audience who were listening to him found what he was saying reassuring. And so therefore, it was no problem. Now, how can this have been so? Well, it may be because Jesus' audience understood some of the simple propositions that I'm going to give you today. As I said, you might want to jot them down so that from time to time as you're reading through the Bible, you can page back there when there's some question of law comes up and run your eye down the list and say to yourself, I wonder if this is true or if I'm misunderstanding. Proposition number one, the law is not and never has been an instrument of salvation. Now, this fact, once you admit it, has very far-reaching implications. And the fact is, I really think everyone knows this. It's just sometimes we act as though we don't. Sometimes in our reading of the Scriptures, sometimes in our talking about the law, you would think that the tacit assumption was that the law was instrumental somehow in salvation. Not so. And you would also think from people's conversation that many people say, well, no, I know the law is not instrumental in salvation now, but it was in the Old Testament. Not so. It never was, it isn't, never has been, and never will be. Now, if you just, as I say, keep that in mind as you read through the Bible, there's going to be occasions where you're going to come across things where the question is going to arise, and you need to remind yourself of this, that that's not what the law is about. I'm not going to take the time in the sermon today to try to prove that point to you. What I'm offering it to you is a proposition for you to prove, for you to examine, for you to think about as you read the Bible. But then here's a question I want you to think more deeply about. If the law was never an instrument of salvation, what was it? What was it for? Because if it wasn't to save us, there must have been some other objective in mind for the giving of the law. Principle number two. The law of God existed long before a word of it was written down. It existed before a word of it was revealed to man. The law of God existed long before a word of it was written down, before it was even revealed to man. The reason for this is not hard to come by. The law of God is a description of the way things are. Now let me see if I can illustrate that for you. Would you say that sexual promiscuity results in the spread of disease. Would anybody want to disagree with that premise? That promiscuous sexual activity in a society leads to the spread of what we used to call venereal diseases, but now, to be more politically correct, we call sexually transmitted diseases, STDs. Okay, it is a law that sexual promiscuity results in disease. It's a law along the lines of the law of gravity, and it's in the nature of things. It just happens. Now, here's my question for you, or let me put it to you another way, just to illustrate it. And I was really struck by this in watching a videotape of a woman giving a presentation to a group of teens that called Sex Has a Price Tag. And she pointed out to them, I think it was 25 years ago or so, there were 5 known sexually transmitted diseases that they had to contend with in society. And I remember when I was in the Navy watching the VD films that they showed us back then, there were 2, 3, 4, maybe 4 or 5 that they were concerned about, that they taught us about to try to scare us into being straight on this matter. Anyway, 25 years ago, there were 5 known STDs. Now, there are 50 known sexually transmitted diseases. Where'd those come from? How have we come to this pass? I think we can say from this that it is a law that an increase in promiscuity results in an increase in disease. Now, here's my question for you. Where is that law written? The answer is that law is written in the human genetic code. That if the human beings marry, stay faithful to one person throughout life, they will in the course of their lifetime exchange all sorts of bacteria, viruses, and everything else. But all that stuff stays with them and it dies with them. But whenever you begin to have promiscuous sexual activity across, marriage lines, and with anybody you please, then you give an indefinite life and indefinite possibility of mutation and development to the various bacteria and viruses that human beings exchange back and forth with sexual activity. And so, as I said, the law is written in the human genetic code. It's the way we are designed. I was reading a book by, I think it was Philip Johnson, who wrote a book called Defeating Darwinism. And he had a really interesting passage in that book. It stopped me like I hit a stone wall when I came to it because I had never considered this before. He talked a lot about how the evolutionists talk about how that there is a chemical development, that whole process of chemical development of human cells and human life forms and so forth. But he came to the point in this one paragraph where he says there is a non-physical, non-chemical element in the DNA of human beings. What is it? It's information. And there is no known way, nor even imaginable really way, in which from lifeless material, inert material, chemical material, information could come out of nowhere into these things. Information, what sort of information? Color of your eyes, color of your hair, how tall you're going to be, how smart you're going to be, how dumb you're going to be. All these things are written into the human genetic code. Along with the fact that the human being is designed to be married to one person, one man, one woman for life. This is the way the creature was made, and it was written into the code from the beginning. So, when God comes along and says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," what is he doing? Is he putting handcuffs on us? Is it like someone once said, well, I think sin is chocolate and God hates chocolate, therefore we're not allowed to do some of those things? Is it a matter that God could just as easily have said, thou shalt commit adultery so we could all have a lot more fun? Or is God a spoil sport? You see, when you begin to understand thou shalt not commit adultery is a revelation, it is a window into the way things are. It's a window into the human genetic code that allows us to understand what's going to kill us as opposed to what's going to make us happy and give us life. Then you have a whole new attitude toward the law. And when you think about it, a law like that is given to reveal to us what is written in the nature of man cannot possibly be abolished unless the nature of man is abolished in the process. So, the written law, thou shalt not commit adultery, existed in principle, all the stuff, long before the word of it was ever written down. Principle number 3, any law that can be abolished surely was not necessary in the first place. I mean, if you can repeal a law, you really didn't have to have it. If you come along and God says, no, we don't have to have those sacrifices and offerings, they don't do any good anyway, we tried those out in the Old Testament, I'm doing away with them. Well, the fact then is that he never had to have them in the first place. Any law that can be abolished was never necessary in the first place, because the very idea of the abolition of law, or even categories of law, presents us with a God who is not constant, cannot be depended on to hold us to the same standards tomorrow that he holds us to today. He is wishy-washy. His law is arbitrary. It's not based on the way things are. It's based upon the way he wants them to be. In other words, sin is chocolate. God hates chocolate. And because he hates chocolate, he's not going to let us have any of it. Principle number 4. While the law of God was included in the Old Covenant, it does not depend in any way on the Old Covenant. Now there's a little note of scripture back in the book of Genesis that I want to take you to. It's Genesis chapter 26, which illustrates what I'm talking about. Genesis chapter 26. And if you're ever discussing the law with someone who thinks it was abolished, this is and has the Old Covenant, New Covenant arguments, this is a good place to go. In Genesis 26, verse 1, there was a famine in the land besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. And Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, to Gerar. And the Lord appeared to him and says, don't go down into Egypt. You stay where I'm going to tell you to stay. Stay in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you, because I'm going to give you and all your descendants all these countries, which I'll perform the oath I swore to Abraham your father. I will make your seed to multiply like the stars of heaven. I'll give unto your seed all these countries, and in your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. Why? Because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Do you realize what he's just said here? He has said that there existed at the time during Abraham's life not merely law, but laws. Not merely laws, but a system of laws. What were they? Many people go through the book of Genesis, and you'll find, again and again, references to the fact it was a sin to lie, sin to commit adultery. People understood, they had an idea of right from wrong, and people say, well, where did they get that? Many people have wondered, well, they see that God rested on the seventh day in the beginning in Genesis, but they say there's no reference anywhere in there to people keeping the Sabbath subsequent to that time. And someone once pointed out, well, the book of Genesis is not a book of laws. But I think a more apt point in this regard is this. Whether Genesis is a book of laws or not, there was a book of laws in existence. Because Abraham knew it, obeyed it, and got a reward because of it, right? Where's that law written down? Well, what people oftentimes forget is that Genesis was written at the same time Exodus was written. I mean, it's all written by Moses. Moses wrote these words down in the book. And so when Moses wrote this particular statement down, what possible laws and statutes and commandments could Moses have had in his mind? And why wasn't it recorded somewhere in the book of Genesis what they were? The answer is simple, because they were recorded in Exodus. The laws that the statutes that Abraham kept, are the same commandments, statutes, and laws that you find in the book of Exodus. These are the commandments, the statutes, and laws that formed the basis of the Old Covenant. They were brought into the Old Covenant. They were the terms of the Old Covenant, and they existed long before the Old Testament and Old Covenant ever came into existence. Why? Well, but I told you before, the law of God is a revelation of what exists already in the DNA, in the genetic code of man. This is who we are. This is what we are. And whenever God comes along and says, don't do that, abstain from these kind of foods, he is telling us to abstain from these kind of foods because they're not good for us, because of the way we are designed. They won't work for us as food. He says, leave them alone. And a wise man will heed what God says and will indeed leave them alone. What is oftentimes not understood is that the Old Covenant was not the law. The Old Covenant was the administration of the law. Just because we have a new administration in Washington, and just because some new statutes are passed along the way, doesn't do anything to change the Constitution of the United States. And whenever God came along and cut a covenant with Israel, It did nothing to change the fundamental law that he had given to Abraham, the fundamental law that he had revealed all along to mankind about right and wrong and the way to live, the way to love your neighbor, and the way to love God. All that stuff is the same. God doesn't change. He is constant. He is absolutely dependable. Principle number 5. And this one is going to stretch your mind maybe just a little bit, but it's really important. A law can exist even though it is not brought into play. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that many of the principles that we find written in the later law existed from the beginning because, as I said, they are written into the nature of man. They are the way we are. So that if certain conditions prevail, then this solution must be applied to it. That has been true from the very beginning as far as that's concerned. At the same time, though, there are some laws that, while they existed in the background, never came into play until sin entered the picture. And for illustration of this, I want you to turn to Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter. This is really a fascinating study to me because it was only when I began to grasp what was going on here and in the New Testament that I fully began to understand the laws of divorce and remarriage. They challenged Jesus on this very point. They came to him and says, "Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for any cause?" And Jesus said, "No way." He said, from the beginning, he said, God made them male and female and said, "A man shall cleave to his wife, they shall become one flesh, and what God has joined together, let not man put asunder." Clear as crystal. And they asked Jesus, saying, "Well, now wait a minute. Why then did Moses in the law say, well, if a man finds fault with his wife, he can give her a writing of divorcement and send her away?" Why did he say that? Well, the scripture in question is Deuteronomy 24 and verse 1, the one they cited to Jesus. "When a man has taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her." The Hebrew word is some matter of nakedness, and it's a euphemistic term that means sexual indiscretion. She's been, in bluntness terms, playing the whore on him. "He has found some uncleanness in her. Then let him write her a bill of divorcement, give it into her hand, and send her out of his house." Now, some people do not believe that this can possibly be what this means because the Old Testament required the death penalty for adultery. And I think you're mistaken. The death penalty, when it was administered in the Old Testament, had to be administered by somebody. There had to be an accuser. Someone had to make a decision to carry that out. And in many cases, people simply did not want to, and if they didn't want to, didn't have to. You know how that the penalty for murder was carried out in the Old Testament, don't you? "You kill my brother, you have bestowed upon me the right to kill you," if you lay in wait for him. If you killed him by accident, you had to run to a city of refuge, and you could stay there. But if it was determined that you lay in wait for him and killed him deliberately, the elders of that city would turn you over to me, and I had the obligation of killing you, or perhaps the opportunity or the right to take your life. That a man had the right to demand his wife's life if she committed adultery. He did not have to do so. And in fact, whenever Joseph thought that Mary was with child, as she, of somebody else, he was minded to put her away privately rather than make a public example of her because he was a just man. So he had the right not to do that under the law and was ready to choose not to do it. Now, here's the question that gets posed to society, though, in this situation. A man has found that his wife has been fooling around on him. He gives her a writing of divorcement, or he gets her out of his house. He doesn't want her around. He doesn't want whatever, bacteria, viruses. He doesn't know any of this stuff, but he doesn't want any of that stuff coming back into his home. And therefore, she can no longer share his bed. She's out of his life. She goes and marries another guy. Then she can hop from that bed to another bed. Maybe then she wants to come back to the original place. And there's something down inside of man that's going to pose an enormous problem if we don't put a damper somehow or other on this bed hopping that's going on out here. Yeah, we could put a damper on it by killing the people who are doing it, but sin has entered the picture. How are we going to keep our society functioning in this situation? Well, here's what he says. He said, "Let him give her a writing of divorcement, put it in her hand, and send her out of his house. And when she is departed, she can go be another man's wife. And if the latter husband hate her and write her a bill of divorcement and gives it into her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the later husband even dies, let's suppose the poor guy dies, and here she is, she's a widow. Her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled. That's an abomination before the Lord. You shall not cause the land to sin which the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance." The implications of all this are that the man had the choice to make of forgiving this woman of the initial offense and keeping her as his wife. If he made the decision to write her a bill of divorcement and sent her away, he was not allowed to ever take her back. Now, where does this come from? You remember Jesus, when he was challenged on this, they said, well, why did Moses allow this to be done this way? Jesus said, because of the hardness of your heart. Because sin has entered the picture, that's why. He says, but from the beginning, it was not so. Then from the beginning, it was God's intent to be one man, one woman, for life. Simple enough to understand, isn't it? Well, when you understand that this is what's going on here, then sin has entered the picture. Additional laws enter the picture. But the laws are a revelation from God of the way things work. We encountered and dealt with an interesting situation along these lines many years ago, of where a man had divorced his wife because of infidelity. She had gone off and married another, or I don't know, lived with another man, I think, and finally had a baby by that other man. And at some later time, he wanted to take her back. And the question we wrestled with was, should he do it? Eventually, he did, and as a result of watching all that took place within that situation, I've come to the conclusion that Deuteronomy 24, I should have known this all along, that Deuteronomy 24 is right. That you are breaking a fundamental principle of human nature, if you will, as well as breaking a basic law of God whenever you do this type of thing. God doesn't prevent you from doing it. He doesn't bat you across the head if you do it. But what happens as a result of our breaking these laws is that we get ourselves deeper and deeper into more and more trouble. The law regarding what to do when people sin existed long before it ever was brought into play. But it didn't have to be used until that time. Galatians 3:19 is an interesting little scripture. It says, wherefore then serves the law? This is Paul speaking. It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. Now here is a classic example in Deuteronomy 24 of a law that was added, as far as the writing of it and the giving of it and the handing down of that law to these people. Sin had entered the picture. A law then had to come across, it had to be brought into play to say, how do we continue to live as a society and as a family in the face of sin that has entered the picture? Now here's an interesting question. Does that mean that the law can pass away once the seed has come? Once the seed has come, then we can do away with the law. Only in this sense, that the removal of the sin, the removal of sin removes the necessity of the added law. In other words, if a law is added because of transgressions until the seed should come, when the seed comes and is able to remove the transgression, then the need for the law that was added disappears as well. However, if sin revives, to use Paul's expression somewhere else, then so does the law. It's not abolished. Another principle under the same heading is a law can exist even though it's passed out of play. Some of the law is culturally based and simply doesn't work in another culture. For example, slavery was carefully regulated in the Old Testament. Slavery is no longer in play. Nobody has any slaves, therefore the laws have no application to us. Are they abolished? No. They're still there. If we were ever to find ourselves in or be a part of a culture in which we were responsible for slaves, all these laws would come back into play once again. And even there, the laws regulating slavery were probably laws that were added because of transgressions. Because you know how a guy got to be a slave? In most cases, he was a thief. He was a thief. And when he couldn't make restitution, he was sold into slavery so that restitution could be made. So even those laws having to do with slavery were added because of transgressions. If slavery were ever in play again, the law would come back into play. Sacrifices, the priesthood, these things are not in play right now. There is no temple. There is no sanctified priesthood. Have those laws been abolished? What's odd about it is we find hints in the Old Testament that whenever Christ returns, or at the time of Christ returns, the temple will be there and they'll be going on again. A law that would be revived like that would not be a law that's been abolished. In God's scheme of things, laws are not passed, they are revealed. Think about that. In God's scheme of things, we're used to laws being passed and enforced, right? Congress is up there debating laws, and they'll get together and they'll work out their conference committees and get a bill passed. The president will sign it. They pass laws which then have to be enforced. God's laws are not passed, they are revealed. They are revelation of the way things are. And in most cases, there is no human enforcement of those laws involved with anything. The laws enforce themselves for the most part. They bring their own consequences. Under the Old Covenant, there was enforcement. And that's the thing that makes the Old Covenant, key, is that the Old Covenant created a civil law and a civil relationship in which certain laws were enforced. But again, you can study the law in vain to find a single instance, even under the Levitical covenant, where the tithing law was ever enforced. There was no internal revenue service in Israel. Tithing was something you did from the heart. It was a choice you made or didn't make. It was up to you. If you were a religious person, you wanted to honor God with the first fruits of your land, you did that. If you didn't do it, no one could take it from you. No one attempted to take it from you. There were laws, like the laws regarding murder, certain laws regarding stealing. These things had to be enforced and were enforced by the elders of the community. Now, once a law is finally revealed in writing, it is never abrogated, as long as heaven and earth are still there. That's what Jesus said. However, those laws are not necessarily in play. It doesn't mean, of course, you always have to keep it, because they may be culturally based. Anything that would make any sense to you or would have any meaning for you or effect to you has long since passed away. You don't have slaves. You've not divorced your wife. None of those things are effective in that way where your life is concerned. Principle number 6. The law is a window into the human genetic code, and it bestows an enormous advantage on the man or the woman who understands it. The law bestows an enormous advantage on the man or the woman who understands it because it's a window into the way things are. Now, if you'll turn back with me to Psalm 119. This is a marvelous passage, and this is a poem that was written in such a way, designed in such a way that it could be more easily memorized in the original language. I don't know that it's particularly any help in trying to memorize it in English. I would say this, though, that if you're going to memorize a scripture, this would be a very good one to memorize and to lock into your consciousness, because there's something very important that's going on in this 119th Psalm, and something that is completely overlooked by most people who think about and study and try to deal with this question of the law of God as it applies to Christians. In the 119th Psalm, he begins by saying, "Blessed are the undefiled in the way, who walk in the law of the Lord." The word blessed basically means happy. The people who actually walk in the law of the Lord, guide their lives by it, are happy people. Blessed are they that keep his testimonies and that seek him with their whole heart. They also do no iniquity. They walk in his ways. You have commanded us to keep your precepts diligently. By the way, in this passage, in this psalm, there are at least 7 synonyms for law. Precepts, statutes, commandments, testimonies, thy word, which also is another synonym for law here. And then he says in verse 5, "Oh, that my ways were directed to keep your statutes. Then shall I not be ashamed when I have respect unto all your commandments." Now, right there we have the first statement made in this whole entire thing of the incredible advantage bestowed upon the person who internalizes and lives his life by the law of God. Now, I'll let you think inside yourself. I don't want to show of hands on anything. But how many times in your life have you been deeply and profoundly ashamed? There have been a few. There have been a few. And by and large, they are times in which you have done something. You've made a mistake. You've done something incredibly stupid. Something maybe you say, I should have known better. You've done these things, and they have hurt you deep down inside. What the psalmist is saying is this, that if I can internalize the law of God, if I can walk down this path, I won't ever have to go through that again. What's it worth not to have to be ashamed? He says, "I will praise you with uprightness of heart when I have learned your righteous judgments. I will keep your statutes. Now, don't forsake me utterly. Wherewithal," verse 9, "shall a young man cleanse his way? By taking heed thereto according to your word." Remember, that's just another way of saying your law. You know, always comes a time, it seems like, in a young man's life when he realizes, I got to take some steps. I got to clean up my life. This is not working. How are you going to do that? The answer? Well, you begin to examine your life in the light of the Word of God, in the light of the law of God. Because how else can you do it? I mean, if you want to straighten up your life, if you want to get your feet in the right path, if you want to begin to walk in the right way, what kind of a standard are you going to use? You know, we oftentimes have hunches and feelings and intuition about things. We see something and something inside of us says, this is not right. We see something inside of us and something else inside of us says, that's good, that's right. Where's that coming from? You know, they tell us that we ought to listen to our intuition more than we do. Because our intuition, our hunches, are the subconscious mind that has gone and taken all the experiences of your life up until this time, the things you have read, the things you have internalized. It puts all these things together and it sets up inside of you a value system. That oftentimes you can't put your finger on what is wrong with this, but you know that something is wrong with it, and they tell us, you better listen to that. True, your intuition may sometimes be wrong, but your intuition should always be listened to. Now, what this young man is talking about doing is beginning to pay attention to his life according to a particular standard. He is internalizing the law of God. He is putting it down inside of himself so that it becomes a part of what informs his intuition, a part of what informs his conscience. For where is your conscience informed? Where is it getting its information? Where is your intuition being informed? Where is it being trained and taught? Where is anything coming from? Well, they're coming from all the things that you put into yourself all your life. I was so shocked when I heard a psychologist once say that everything that you read, everything you see, everything you hear, and everything you experience goes into your mind and it stays there forever. It's a closet, he said, you never get to clean out. You can't. All you can do is try to make sense of the things that are in there, to relate them to other things that are in there. And so the question is, what's going in? An important thing, this man says, what I want to be going in there is the law, the Word of God, because it will inform my conscience and my intuition of the way I'm supposed to be going. With my whole heart have I sought you, let me not wander from your commandments. Your word have I hid in my heart, that I might not sin against you. Modern term is, I've internalized your word, or I've memorized your word. I have somehow or other put that down inside of me as a part of what informs my subconscious mind of the difference between right and wrong, so that my intuition is solid, so that my hunches are right, and I'm not being led off down the garden path by somebody. Blessed are you, O Lord, teach me your statutes. With my lips I have declared all the judgments of your mouth. I have rejoiced in the way of your testimony like I would in all riches. You know, why not? What he has found here is the secret code to the meaning of life and the way to live a life. And when you found it and it bestows an enormous advantage over other people, why wouldn't you rejoice in it as you would over all treasure? It's like finding a secret lock, a secret key, a secret code. I will meditate in your precepts. I'll have respect unto your ways. I'll delight myself in your statutes. I will not forget your word. Now, this isn't someone who dreads the law. This isn't someone who grudgingly keeps the law. I was discussing recently this with someone who was talking about, well, you know, I kept the Sabbath, but I never really kind of proved it myself, and I really didn't, you know, he was really muttering around, didn't really like it. It was a burden to him, didn't want to do it. And he said, I couldn't get a job, and nothing was working for me. Never dawned on that man. Never crossed his mind what he was saying. What he was saying was, I hated the Sabbath day, and when I went out to get a job, I couldn't get one, and I wasn't blessed for it. And he never made the connection in his mind that it was because he didn't like it, because he didn't really believe it, because he actually accepted it because somebody else had told him so. There was absolutely nothing inside of that young man to say, I have gone to the Bible, I have internalized it, I have proved it, I believe it, I rejoice in it, I'm happy with it. Where would the blessing from God come from? Why should God lift a finger for that young man? Deal bountifully with your servant that I may live and keep your word. Open my eyes that I may behold wondrous things out of your law. I am a stranger in the earth. Don't hide your commandments from me. You know, he wanted these things. I want to know what they are. I want to know where the rocks are. I want to know where the problems are. I want to know where the pitfalls are. And that is where they come from. Now, I'm not going to try to read the entirety of this psalm because it is too long, and I would really like to leave it for you to study for yourself. But I want to kind of list for you what this young man found in this psalm that made him so appreciative, so consider the value of the law, what it was. Listen to these things: freedom, liberty, more understanding than his teachers. He didn't have to be ashamed anymore. It helped him clean up his life. It removed reproach and contempt from him. He didn't have to endure those things. It gave him sound advice so that whenever he had to weigh decisions, he had something to base those decisions on. It kept him honest. It opened up his vision and made him into a big person. Prevented the common corruptions of covetousness, the common petty little stuff that lead to corruption of your life, and one thing leads to another. It prevented all that because he had internalized the law of God. It gave him good judgment, enabled him to speak with confidence before powerful men. He said, I'm not afraid to stand in front of kings and speak. It gave him confidence because he had when you know what you're talking about, when you have a basis of understanding so that you know what you're saying is right, it gives you an enormous amount of confidence. It gave him freedom from fear. It gave him the right kind of friends. And boy, what's that worth? It gave him an ordering of his knowledge and conveyed wisdom. And this little thing, the ordering of knowledge, it gave him a pattern, a framework into which his knowledge could be fit, into which his experiences and all the things he learned in life could be rationalized. It gave him a long life. It strengthened him, his character, and helped him to survive affliction. It made him wiser than his enemies, helped him to see his way clear on the things he had to do, helped him to avoid snares that were set for him. It made him safe. It helped him to recognize the right way from the false. Now, there's a word for this. It's not in many people's vocabularies, and I'm not even suggesting you put it in yours. The word is epistemology. It's that branch of philosophy that examines the origin, nature, methods, and limits of human nature. It's the study of how we know things. That epistemology is the framework that allows us to listen to perhaps you're on the internet or you're reading some of the stuff that comes out, and you read this story, and there's something inside of you that says, that cannot possibly be true. Sometimes you are able to put your finger right on why it can't be true. Sometimes you are not sure. Sometimes you have no idea. It's just that you know it cannot be true. Why is that? It's because it won't fit in the framework of knowledge that you have put together. Through your life, you accumulate all sorts of information and knowledge. And even sometimes in your sleeping hours, your mind is working. It's working, creating relationships between the things that you know. It's hooking up what's in this little cubby hole up here with what's in this little cubby hole over here. The very bad parts of things, where there's some really bad stuff in there. It's connecting that bad stuff to explanations. It's connecting it to rationalizations. It's connecting it to truths about and lessons learned from. So that all these things begin to finally, the hurt begins to recede in the background and the lesson from it comes to the fore. Most of the stuff happens while you're asleep. Some of it happens while you're awake. And one of the reasons for your nightmares is there's a scanner that's going down through and looking in the little cubby holes in your brain and picking and making relationships, and it just sees that one little thing in there, and it goes through your mind and the brain and in the dream, and it goes right on. There's no time, there's no sequence, there's no really sensible meaning to any of those stuff. It's just the processing that's going on while you are asleep. It's dealing with these things at the subconscious level, sometimes things which you cannot deal with at the conscious level. Sometimes because you don't even realize that they're there. Well, what I mean by the law of God giving you an epistemology, it gives you a framework, and it puts stuff in there, in that closet that will never be cleaned out. That as you think about it, and as you meditate on it, as you intensify it in your mind, it gives you explanations. It gives you understandings. It creates relationships between the things that happen. It gives you meaning. And one of the most distressing, disturbing, and destructive things that can ever happen to the human mind is the loss of meaning. My life doesn't mean anything anymore. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what life's all about anymore. I really think that one of the great causes of depression, and the reason why many people, end their lives, is because they no longer find any meaning in their lives. Well, that is something that the man who wrote this psalm was trying very hard to avoid. And the law of God, he said it's like a light to my feet and a lamp to my path. I can see where I'm going. I'm not going to fall down and get hurt. It gives me understanding. And I really think that what's not well understood is that it's important that we work at this. I've always been fascinated when I've met Jewish people and sat around and talked with them for any length of time, that as an ethnic group, considered as ethnic groups, they are among the wisest people that I have ever met. I know that you can meet fools among the Jews just like you can meet fools among any other people, but I'm talking about as a class or as a group of people. And I think there's a reason for this. I think one of the primary reasons for it is down through history, their people have held as a fundamental value the study of Torah. That they see that the study of Torah is an end and a value in and of itself. It isn't that you do the Torah and then God is going to have to do something good for you because you study Torah. That's not the way they believe it. They believe that the study of Torah is a good, is an end, is a value in and of itself. And the only way that can be true is because the law is real. It's the way things are. It has to do with the way things really work in the real world. And then the process of the continual studying of Torah, the embedding of that wisdom and that knowledge in the hearts and the minds of men, combined with experience as they live their lives, has generated an enormous amount of wisdom that many people show no sign of. The study of the law of God gives you a powerful framework for the knowledge that you accumulate, the experiences you go through. It helps you differentiate between what you can really know and what you cannot even hope to know. If you've heard much about the internet, you probably have heard the term search engines. The law of God is the knowledge engine. It's the thing that drives knowledge, the thing that controls knowledge, the thing that puts knowledge in its place, that gives it shape and gives it form. If you're ever talking to somebody who has this struggle, here, give them this challenge. Tell you what you do. Read the 119th Psalm and sit down and write a letter to that man and tell him why he was wrong, why he didn't need it, why it wasn't important, and how it's possible that when Jesus came, that law could be abolished. To the man who wrote this psalm, that would make no sense at all. The simple fact that the law of God actually is written into the human genetic code, that the written law of God that you and I see is nothing more than a manifestation, a revelation to us of what that is. When you understand it has powerful implications, especially when you realize that man is made in the image of God. And therefore, all the way down to the very core of our being and what gives our life meaning, we are made in the image of God. Principle number 7, and this is one of the most important of all. Finally, Jesus is our rabbi, our interpreter, our teacher of the law. Under the Old Covenant, Moses was the teacher of the law. And if you've been paying much attention around the Church of God to some of the debates going on these days, you probably have heard people talk about how that the Pharisees, Jesus said, well, the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Whatever, therefore, they bid you to do, you do that. But don't do what they do, because they say and they don't do. And the assumption on that is that Jesus, having made that statement to a Jewish audience at that time, that means that the church forevermore is bound by the decisions made by the Pharisees. The problem with that is that the Pharisees didn't even agree with one another about the decisions they made. So you got to ask the question, which Pharisees are you talking about? But it's beside the point. What's to the point is Deuteronomy 18, verse 17. Deuteronomy 18, verse 17. The Lord said unto me, they have well spoken what they have said. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto you. I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I shall command him. It shall come to pass that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. I don't think you'll find a commentary in the world or a Bible teacher in the world who doesn't understand who that prophet is. That prophet is Jesus. So, when Jesus said that the Pharisees sat in Moses' seat, he was referring to them as a part of the Old Covenant administration. Their role in that administration was a legitimate role. That's all that Jesus is saying. But when Jesus sat down with the disciples at the Last Supper, and he passed a cup around to them and says, here, take this, drink this. This is my blood of the New Testament. He's saying, my blood of the new covenant. And when they drank that blood, they entered into a new covenant with Jesus Christ. And we don't know a lot about that particular covenant at that moment. What we do know is that in Hebrews 8, when God talks about a new covenant with the house of Israel, he says, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah in those days. I will write my law in their hearts. Not a new law. I'm not going to give them a different law. It's just that instead of it being over here in a code, I'm going to write it in their hearts, in their conscience. They're going to know deep down inside of themselves what the truth is. Now, basically what Jesus did with his disciples when he entered into this agreement or this covenant with them, he became their Moses, as it were. He was that prophet. He was the teacher of the law. He was the interpreter of the law, and he replaced Moses as that prophet for the church. The Pharisees, what they taught is utterly irrelevant to the church. What is relevant to the church is what Jesus Christ said. Now, I would like to suggest to you, once again, I haven't given you these principles as some new doctrinal thing. What I'm hoping that you'll do is you'll keep them at hand, and as you read the Bible, you'll think about them, and you'll look at them and tell them, and ask yourself, is it right? Is it wrong? Check them out and see if they help resolve for you some of the questions that I raised at the beginning of this thing as to the confusion that exists in the relationship between the Christian, the way of life as a Christian, and the law of God.